Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jack,
John,
thanks for joining me today, mate.
it's a pleasure.
That's a lie.
What do you mean? Where else would I want to be, John?
Today we thought we would talk about transfer of training and particularly from adjunct activities. It's a question that we often get asked, and actually we were talking with a coach earlier today who asked this very exact question, and he said in his discussions with strength and conditioning coaches, they'll say, oh, well, if you can perform this in a jump task or a force output task like an isometric mid-thigh pull, that means that you'll be able to do X. And if you can't do this, then therefore you won't be able to run at this speed or jump with this capability. But he asked a really relevant question, which I think is, what is the evidence that that correlation is one exact? Because it's probably not going to be, causal. And the second thing is, is the claim that they're making correct? Is that transfer as clear and as linear as they've made out? Or are there things that do transfer better and ones that, whilst they probably transfer at some level, the correlation is not as strong?
The first thing I think about with this is a topic of conversation we had recently is about specificity again. Because I think we need to be cautious when we talk about specificity of going, well, we see a similar force production profile in, say, an isometric mid-thigh pull with a jump performance, right?
Yeah, and even in like Olympic lifts and squatting.
Yes.
And they go across the whole spectrum of the force velocity and even movement spectrum.
Yes, and I'm not dismissing that there isn't a correlation there. There definitely is. But we need to be cognizant of, like, one, the strength of the correlation, but also two, seeing that that correlation varies from individual to individual. And a good question to ask ourselves is, why is that? Because even though there may be a similar profile in force production and rate of force development, there are actually differences in the specific tasks. The obvious thing is related to the actual mechanics of the movement, i.e. an isometric type of contraction if we're thinking of, say, an isometric mid-thigh pull versus, say, a counter movement jump. But then also the utilization or how that force is produced as well. And obviously thinking about a counter movement jump being a lot more utilization of a stretch shortening cycle. And that does utilize different components of the myofascial network in a different way. And the reason why I bring this up is I think we need to be cautious when we use the term specificity, because specificity needs to be thinking about its specific correlation to the mechanical demands and the physical demands of that task, as opposed to certain variables within that particular movement pattern.
Someone that people know that I absolutely love is, or at least the work that is related to, is Bondarchuk, right? And actually, this is what Bondarchuk did his PhD on.
Right.
So what he did was he did his PhD looking at Soviet athletes and the correlations between their performance in tasks, say, associated with adjunct training, things like lifting tasks, jumping tasks, sprinting tasks, and how well that transferred to their actual event. And I know that we've spoken about this before, but there's a really good schematic that was actually developed by Tom Crick. And Derek Everly talks about this a lot for those people that are interested. And he's actually got a Bondarchuk course that he's translated for people. Yes. But what he talks about in this is that pyramid hierarchy where the exercise selection is based on how specific it is. And right at the pointy end, the things that's going to transfer the most is the competition activity, right? So if that's a field sport, it's playing that sport. And then as you go away from that, it gets further and further away. Transfer is going to be less and less. And where that concept came from for Bondarchuk was his research that he did. And what he found was at very elite levels, the correlation between some of these adjunct tasks in the performance actually started to diverge, right? But don't misinterpret that. There are minimum standards of performance in physical characteristics that you would need. So if you want to be a 70-meter plus hammer thrower, which is obviously the area of coaching that he was famous for, and he was a hammer thrower himself, you're probably not going to get away with benching 50 kilos or squatting 50 kilos. You just don't have the raw absolute strength and force output to be able to apply to create the, as you said, the ergonomic capabilities to throw a hammer over 70 meters. However, and he talks about this, and Everly talks about this actually in some of his translations of this, once people say, for instance, we're squatting more than 200 kilos, and these are heavy guys, they're probably 100 kilo plus athletes, so it's 2 times body weight. Going from 200 to 250 didn't necessarily seem to transfer for certain individuals. But that didn't mean that some people weren't much stronger than that. It just seemed that there was a minimum threshold that you needed to be at. And I think the task, you mentioned the specifics. I think the task that you need to go through, and this is what Bondarchuk tried to do, is work out in your sport. If you take elite performers, what are the basic physical characteristics that they have? And you almost have to get an average level of performance across all of those physical characteristics to work out what's the minimum that I need to be able to get away with that level of performance. And like a simple one, for instance, is if you're an elite, I don't know, say AFL football player, and you cannot, you're trying to touch your toes, right, in a toe touch stretch, just sitting on the ground, feet out in front of you together. If you can't touch to your knee, is that an issue? And if you went across and you say, okay, it's hard to be completely objective, but you say like, okay, these are the top 50 players in the AFL, and you want to be in the top 50. If all of them can touch their toes and you can only touch your knee, then maybe you're not meeting the physical requirement in that area of flexibility.
Yeah, well, on that topic then, of thinking of Bondarchuk's hierarchy, you've got sport specific, you've got competitive sport, sport specific,
yes,
general specific, general preparatory.
Yes, the general specific is called special development exercises.
Yes,
and typically he would put gym in the special development exercises, like the third tier down.
Well, I was just the reason why I phrase it that and thinking about that hierarchy is if you have an athlete, where do we start? Because I think that's perhaps where there can be some confusion or misdirection, or at least perhaps some differing opinions of, do you start from the top up and work your way down to look at how well developed that individual is for the sport, or do you start the other way around? Now, when it comes to professional sport, I would think that you'd probably need to start at the top, because the biggest transfer that you have has to do with how well you're actually able to perform that task, and therefore how successful you are at winning.
It's interesting. I think we've spoken a lot about profiles and things like that. I think that influences, but I think let's go to like a developing athlete.
Okay.
I think you actually you polarize it.
Yes.
Right. So you let them play the sport. They play hockey or they play basketball, and then you actually start at the other end of the bottom. So rather than and I think this is actually an interesting issue that we're having that's causing over-specialization, is that people are doing the things in the special preparatory and special development area before they're doing the general exercises.
Okay, so we probably need to think about this in different ways of where they are in their development and maturation. So if you're in that developmental phase, you're thinking that they're missing out on a lot of those foundational elements.
In my mind, and I'm not saying this is right, but the way that I would actually start with is say, like, let them play the sport and then start developing really general characteristics, flexibility, abdominal and trunk strength. Can they do body weight exercises through large and full ranges of motion, right? Like, those are the general development things that they need. Do they have postural awareness? Do they have coordinative capabilities? And they can be different tasks, not even related to their sport, but like, can they do general coordinated things and can they play their sport?
Yes.
And then what you actually do is you start to close that gap. People probably can't see me, but I'm putting my hands together.
Yeah.
You start filling in. And actually, funnily enough, I would probably, in my mind, if I think about it now, and I haven't even necessarily thought about this previously, but I would let them play the sport because we do sport for a particular reason, and it's definitely not to train.
No,
right? It's boring,
and it's beyond just physical development too, because
there's so much socialization, and teamwork, and
problem solving.
Exactly.
Yeah, all the.
But
elements.
let them play the activity that it is, and participate in the competitive exercise. then I would probably, if it was a junior athlete, I'd probably start with general, and then I would actually go from general to the development exercises. So the third tier. So I would do first tier would always be there, fourth tier would always be there. Then I would actually go to the third tier, and then finally I would do second tier. So
Well,
where the second tier is tasks that are ergonomically similar, but they potentially have some sort of over or under exertion on that task.
yeah, just to flesh this out further, because we've obviously recently spoken about specialization versus generalization or non-specialization in developing in youth and adolescence. And it's obviously related to this because in many ways, do you actually think that for a child, when they're participating in multiple sports, they are actually developing those general preparatory
Exactly.
elements anyway?
Totally. And that they're the things that I think, and it's one of the things that, like, for
Y-
people who know Vern Gambetta,
Mm.
right?
I actually don't think I do.
You don't know Vern?
No.
No, you're not on, yeah, I know that you're on Twitter or X. You need to follow Vern. He's a curmudgeon, but he was a strength and conditioning coach, track coach.
What is a curmudgeon?
Someone like me, an antagonist.
Okay.
He likes to provoke people, but he's been involved in the sports development, sports performance realm for a really long time. And he's in his 70s or early 80s even now. And he's one of the ones who was just like, guys, we saw this 30 or 40 years ago. Like, don't bring this crap back. Like, we don't need to see this cycle again. We've seen it. He gets into lots and lots of arguments, for instance, with the hamstring injury group about the fact that Nordics are not a good exercise for hamstring injury prevention. And he's got his reasons. I won't go into them. But the good thing about someone like Vern is he talks a lot, and I actually saw him talk here in Melbourne. It might have been last year, actually. He came out with the VIS, brought him out, I believe. And he speaks about the fact that one of the reasons he thinks that we're seeing issues related to injury is that general phase is missing. And one of the big factors he believes is influencing that is the lack of general development of physical education, particularly in schools. And he always puts up these pictures. He does it online, but he did it in his presentation of like what physical education looked like when he was at school in like the 60s and when he was teaching in 70s and 80s. And it literally looked like almost military calisthenics training. But they would get all the kids out, and you had to be able to do pull-ups and go across the monkey bars and do push-ups and do a handstand and be able to jump onto a box and do all this. And as you said, it's just general physical development. And he said that was a really good foundation for people then to go into their sport because they could play baseball, they could swim, they could do all of these different things. And so then when they go, I actually want to do basketball, jumping repeatedly and running up and down the court 400 times in a game was not an issue because they had actually done a lot of general physical development. And then you could make the training more specific. And I think he's, on that front at least, I believe he's right. I think it's one of the big factors that is missing in many respects to why we see a lot more of these, not weird injuries, but almost like more serious injuries. Like we've spoken about this previously of like a lot of young athletes having like tendon rupture type injuries. And you're like, where are all these injuries coming from? And I think it's because they lack the general physical development that previous generations potentially were exposed to. And that means that they're not losing capability because, genetically they have, for instance, the output function. And we talk about software and hardware, but they just haven't been jumping out of trees and running around and doing gymnastic type tasks and all of these different things. They play sport and then they don't really do anything else. And it leaves them susceptible to this kind of stuff. So I generally feel that he's probably right. And that's why I think you probably let them play the sport, but develop those general characteristics first.
It makes me think then too, because the other thing that you have seen a big push towards is resistance training in adolescence. And we did speak about this recently.
Yeah.
And it's not to suggest that isn't right, but there is a important sequence of how you go about implementing resistance training, because resistance training doesn't mean you need to have a bar on your back and plates and be squatting 1.5, 2 times your body weight by the time, you're 15.
A lot of
Part of
it
that,
are like these things we're talking about, like
well, part of
body
that,
awareness and coordination and
totally.
flexibility and gymnastic type, calisthenic type capabilities. Can you do 20 push-ups?
Yes.
Can you do a pull, 5 pull-ups? Like they're not hard things, and it's really funny because I think that that's one of the big things that I notice with athletes that, for instance, come into my training squad. They're very capable athletes. Like, most of them are very, very high level when they
Mm,
come. But one of the things I always say is, like, everyone in our squad needs to be able to do 10 strict pull-ups at a minimum, right? And even, like, a lot of the times it's usually the females, they're like, oh, like, and it's like, no, 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 no.
you can do
You
this.
can do this.
Yeah.
And now the funny thing is all of them can.
Well, it's interesting then too, thinking about going back to this idea of transferability, because in a immature system, and what I mean by that is someone with a low training history, the reality is, and you see it all the time, there's a lot of things that you could do and you will see improvement.
Hmm.
Because for someone who doesn't have much exposure, obviously you could get them to do just sport specific stuff and you're going to see an improvement in their output. You could get them to do that more sport specific, general specific development. You're going to see an improvement in their output. You could do more of that just general preparatory, more broad stuff, and you're going to see an improvement in their output. That probably is a good starting point because although you do see that correlation in the short term, part of the conversation needs to be about where are we actually going with this individual's development? Because for someone who is young or with a low training history, are you really thinking 3 months or 6 months, or are you thinking 3 years, 5 years, 6 years?
Well,
And
no, go. Yeah.
well, and I think that's another important thing then to think about with correlations to, say, resistance training movements and certain sport specific movements. That correlation does exist, but it probably exists only to an extent. And you mentioned this before. We're thinking about, say, the development of a squat relative to your body weight for hammer throws as an example, where you do see that correlation, but then you do start to see that
tail off.
tail off.
And that's exactly what you're saying, is that transfer early on is going to be there, but then there becomes a divergence. And it's very similar to that discussion we've had on the development of health through the participation in sport, right? When you first start participating in sport, your health in almost a linear fashion will improve with your participation. But then once you reach a certain amount of participation, say you're, I don't know, like a very elite level, the training you're doing is so difficult that it actually is stressing your health. And participation in elite sport is not necessarily healthy, right? It can be, but it's not necessarily. And I think that's where people get confused because they're like, oh, you're a marathon runner, like that's healthy. And it's like, yeah, well, you try and do 200 kilometers a week for 10 years and see how your joints go and see how, your actual physical health is and, your immune system and how well it tolerates that and, your sleep and all of those things. Like that's a very stressful experience.
Well, the other thing I think about with this conversation is the concept of your window of adaptation and of diminishing returns.
Yes.
Because I think the other thing here too, when you think about transferability and you're thinking about some type of planning or periodization, if you're working with an individual with a low training history, there needs to be that long-term planning
approach
to it. And again, the younger that you have someone in their career or in their development, the more adaptation you're going to see and the more opportunity you're going to see big improvements in short periods of time. But then the two things I think about then is, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts because you've had more experience with it, is how do you actually plan about moving through those different phases of like the Bondarchuk model, if we're going to use that as an example. But then also too, once they actually start to really get that development and you get to that point of diminishing returns, how does that influence what you need to do to try and maximize some transferability of all their training to getting those 1% improvements in their performance?
I think that, as you said, the correlations with more generalized and even those special development exercises versus special preparatory exercises is like the stuff in the gym. I think it creates a good platform, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it transfers. What it tells you is that they are not going to be limited because of that physical characteristic in their ability to do the competitive task.
'Cause I know you've mentioned before that there are plenty of sprint coaches out there who are not convinced that resistance training really has a role in sprint performance.
Well, the reason that I say that is because there's people who have gotten away with basically doing almost no resistance training,
Mm.
right? And that very clearly shows you that it's not as simple as that. The point that you have to consider, though, is does that person have the characteristics needed? And some people naturally have those characteristics.
Yeah.
They can, they've got a huge amount of elastic capability. They can bounce, and they, for instance, might be able to develop huge amounts of power.
Mm.
They just haven't developed it through resistance training.
Mm.
The problem is if you're someone who doesn't have those and you think that you're going to be able to get away with that, because I think that there are,
Or the other person of the athlete that continually gets injured, I guess, too, is the other one.
so I think what you have to do is have necessary base capabilities where you're not limited by that. And say, for instance, in endurance training, it would be like, say, someone's VO2 max. Now, we know that once it gets sort of beyond about 70, the correlation in elite performers is not necessarily that, oh, your VO2 is 80 and mine's 75, therefore you're a better marathon runner. We know that correlation is not there because whilst that is an important correlate of aerobic function, it's not
for a developing or like a semi-professional athlete or a sub-elite athlete.
Yeah, but like you probably say to be an elite marathon runner, it needs to be at least maybe 70. But beyond that, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get better. So consistently maybe doing that aerobic or VO2 max development may not actually transfer. Now, for some people, if that's the limiting factor for them, like they're really good in the other areas, their running technique's really good, and they've got really good, say, running economy from an elastic point of view, and they're
good active joint stiffness.
Exactly, all of these things. Then maybe, like that's the thing that if they go from 70 to 75, that will make the absolute difference for them. But if it's the other way around, where their VO2 max is 80 or 85, like something ridiculous, which there's not obviously that many people that have ever been measured that high. But if it was something, but their running technique's really poor, their running economy is limited because of mechanical factors or tissue capacity factors, they might lose to the person whose VO2 max is 70 but has those factors developed, because they all contribute, and it's more about what's limiting you. So I think the big thing that you need to work out is, and as I said at the start, in elite performers, what's the minimum standard that you have to achieve across the board? And you'll find what that baseline is. So if you haven't developed that in your athletes, then you're in trouble. I think that's where the game is with the developing athlete. Your job is to go, okay, they're pretty good at the sport itself. I've developed some of these general characteristics. Now I need to start filling in the gaps of what are the performance correlates. So if it's in as an endurance sports, it's like, am I developing their VO2 to a level that is now not limiting their capability? And what I'm going to do then is, and if it's in another sport, for instance, it might be like, if it's a speed power sport, it might be like, okay, I need to develop their explosiveness, their power output, whether that's early or late rate of force development, their jump capability, the isometric, force output, or whatever it is. I need to get those up to a minimum standard. And once they've reached that in their development, they're probably then ready to start being exposed to the more specific but not competitive exercises. And what I mean by that, for instance, like it might be the design of an exercise or a drill. It might be in running, for instance, it might be like hill running or downhill running or sled runs or overspeed training, or, in a soccer setting, for instance, it might be, like doing drills that are small-sided games where it's very close. It's very it's close to being specific, but it's not the same as the full field competitive exercise. You're actually manipulating the environment to either overstress or create increased resistance to. Like one of the ones that I think works really well in a field sports setting is you having, say, many more defenders and attackers and still having to navigate that. It's maybe not something that you're going to experience in the actual match play, but it's more difficult then. So it becomes a really good way of developing those things. But it may not be something that you expose a 12-year-old to because they're not ready to have 2 attackers on 8 defenders.
No, I'm just thinking about a framework then of putting this together, because it seems to me that if you have a good athlete, it's very likely that through their development, they've had exposure to sport and they've developed certain skill sets, physical, psychological, technical, tactical elements related to that. They've had that good general preparatory development. That's probably, sorry?
You hope.
Well, you hope, but I mean, that's going to happen to an extent if you've been exposed to diverse sports. Like if you swam and you played basketball and you did cross country, you're probably going to have some level of that. And hopefully along the way, you've had just doing things like you were mentioning before of being out in the playground or learning to jump or, learning to climb a tree even, for instance.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that if you then have a good athlete but still has a relatively low training history, the thing that was already developed is they obviously have certain skills within a sport. Because obviously if they didn't, they're not going to be a good athlete at that sport.
I actually think this is one of the big, and I'm pretty sure it was Vern that was talking about this, but like it's one of the big problems we have at the moment with the lack of informal play that children are allowed to do.
Sure. Like particularly nowadays within like the city environment, because of the lack of actual physical environments for children to play in very diverse, complex ways.
I think it's one of the big factors, and it's changed a lot. Like I know that, and I'm sure you grew up more in the country, but I'm a city kid. But even like I remember literally every single day after school, there was 2 things I was doing. I was either riding my bike, and I would literally ride my bike until it got dark on my own, and I'd be down near the creek, and we used to dig out jumps and all sorts of stuff. Me and a couple of guys from down the street, or even sometimes I'd go on my own. I'd be riding up and down the hill and jumping off stuff and trying to do all sorts of silly things and falling off and grazing your arm.
Yeah.
Or we'd be in the park kicking the football that was down the street, and we'd be playing small-sided matches against each other, and again, until it got dark. And that was every single day. There was not a day that I went home and just sat there and watched TV.
Yeah. Well, and I was just thinking then, like going back to that developed athlete, you've kind of got those 2 ends of the spectrum developed. So that's at that point, that's when you start to think.
Do you think that actually, like I want to say, like, do you think that that's something that's missing now because we're very worried about safety? Like, I think
the other thing though too is the other reality is how much screen time, like not just children and adolescents, even adults have.
Oh yeah.
What do most people preoccupy themselves with? Being on social media, being on YouTube, playing video games, and like the reality is a lot of socialization is online now too.
Yeah,
you play video games with your mates online, which was not a thing when you and I were growing up.
Because the thing that I think that has changed, which is interesting, is now a lot of that stuff was very informal with kids. As I said, like we would organize that ourselves. We were 9, 10, 11 years old, just kicking the footy, or we'd just be riding our bikes and doing all sorts of things. And honestly, like it sounds bad, but our parents were just like, yeah, just make sure you're home by a certain time.
Yeah.
If it gets dark, be home. I don't see that happening where there's a whole group of kids on their own riding their bikes or doing, like, if I do, it's rare. And I feel like one of the things that's happened, because there's this fear of safety stuff, that there's a lot of activities now that are over-organized, and there's a parent in attendance, and we're going to have a referee, and we're going to do, it's like, it actually probably, and this is a complete side issue, but it allows kids to actually even navigate problem solving between themselves. And I think that's something that seems to have diminished. I'm sure it's not gone completely, but it's really changed where everything's very organized now. Like, oh no, we've organized the play day and we're all going to go to the park and we're going to play a game, and as a parent, I'm going to referee that. It's like, no, you kids take your bikes and go for it.
It makes me think of, Jonathan Haidt, obviously, the social psychologist from, is he at New York University, I think?
I don't know where he's now. I know he was at Virginia.
And he's written many books, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah, well, that's the one he talks very much about, this how his daughter, he let her go down the street and buy stuff from the bakery.
I was literally going to mention that story, or like letting his 12-year-old son navigate his way to school or something like that through public transport. And in fact, someone pulling up the kid
criticized him. Yeah,
what are you doing? Why are you here by yourself? And the kid was saying, well, I'm going to school or the library or whatever it is. Like, where's your dad? Where's your parents? And there's been a very big shift from okay, I'm going to give you some level of responsibility to be able to problem solve and navigate your way through this, to that's actually just, neglect.
Well, and as I said, I think that freeform play disappearing has led to less of that overall general development that we spoke about. And it's
Absolutely.
almost, without meaning to, it's actually made children's sport more specialized, not actually because the thing that they're doing is specialized, but because they like, oh no, this is organized, we're going to play a game, rather than it actually just being kids working out what kids want to do.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
that they set up the game themselves and they play it in the way that they want to play it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really big factor that people probably underestimate, because there are certain differences that are probably going to happen through your actual physical interaction, but then also more importantly, how you diversify the rules of the game or the boundaries and parameters of the game. Not to mention some of then the psychological elements related to how you actually navigate working that out with a bunch of kids who have all their own, set of beliefs and opinions, and probably aren't as good as being able to navigate and take into consideration other people.
Mm. I think if, like,
Well, yeah.
I think it was, yeah, say what you're going to say, but I think we should get back onto, okay,
Well, I was just going to
what's
go
transferring those specific tasks.
totally, because I think it's good to think about the example of a good athlete that you're working with who's developed the upper and lower ends of that particular hierarchy, and then thinking about what comes next for their development. Because there's certainly obviously sport specific elements. You might have a sprinter or a soccer player who clearly has certain skill sets but may be deficient in other things. But some of those deficiencies then may come down to some of their physical attributes as well, and how that actually supports their ability to do certain physical tasks or demand of the sport. So I think that's where we can start to think about then, how do sport specific and how do that general specific elements fit in to helping an individual who's gone through that initial phase of development then go to achieve what they potentially can.
Yeah, well, I think it's at that point it's doing that needs analysis and trying to work out what are the factors that really contribute to that overall performance. So as I said, if it's in a speed power event, people, if it's especially if it involves running, it's like, okay, people need explosive power.
Yes.
They may need to jump, may need to be able to accelerate or sprint or decelerate or change direction. And if that's the case, there are physical characteristics that underpin that.
And I was about to say, just on a side note, this is probably where we don't have to go down this too much, but then thinking about individual athlete profiles is also useful as well, because there is going to be the individual, when we think about someone like Power, who's going to be much better at developing the force element of the power equation versus the velocity element, and vice versa.
Yeah, but it's good that you bring that up, because what we need to work out is, okay, are these elements needed? And if they are, then I think you go from general to specific. Like, I recently got asked about this of like, okay, because obviously, we did a sprint course, and it was a mixed group in terms of the understanding of that group. And it was interesting because we had a whole section and a whole period of time based on strength and conditioning. And there were people who were really advanced, who were asking really nitty gritty questions like, oh, what should, this parameter be in the eccentric phase, and what rate of force development should I be looking for, and how many multiples of the force output, and X, Y, Z. And then there were people asking, oh, I've got a junior athlete, what do I do with them? They're doing bodyweight circuits, what's next? And it's like, okay, you need to consider developing things across the force velocity spectrum, and you need to be thinking about that in a generalized manner. So what I mean by that is, like, you should have tasks that low force, low velocity, then move your way through that to low velocity, high force. It's not that typical that you have
high velocity, low force.
Yeah.
But you probably could think of more. I
like
think when you get into
movements and things like that.
Well, I think when you get into the high velocity element, you probably need to be thinking of, is it something where you are early versus like late RFD in particular, and utilization or like utilization of ground reaction forces.
Exactly.
Too.
But the thing that we spoke about as well is, like, are they doing that through large ranges of motion? Because what you want to see, and are they doing it across different contraction types.
Mm.
So we spoke very heavily about, okay, you want someone who's developing those underlying physical characteristics to have good output when it comes to isometric. So there's not a lot of joint movement, at least. We know that if you want to get into the technicalities, there is some movement that is occurring within the muscular tendinous unit, but we won't get into that. So you want to see, okay, are they developing isometric capabilities in positions throughout that range? So maybe it's, their knees really bent, or maybe their knees quite straight, or somewhere in between and throughout that. Then, and that's the whole idea of like through range. It's like, inner, outer, middle of the range. Are they able to create concentric forces in all of those ranges? Are they able to create eccentric capabilities, force output, and control through those ranges? And then what you want to do once they can do those things is then can you increase the velocity of that, again, carrying out through all of those ranges? Because if they have high force output and high velocity output, obviously is usually associated with high force as well, throughout all the different ranges, then they're physically prepared for whatever they're going to encounter through their sport.
Yes.
And the problem you tend to have sometimes is when people go to developing some of these characteristics, they lose perspective that the development requires it across that whole spectrum. They go, oh, well, a soccer player is never going to be in a full squat position in their task, so we're not ever going to squat to full depth. And it's like, yeah, but for a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old, they need to have developed strength through all of that range. They need to even maybe do at a certain time like a pause squat at the bottom, because you want them to have isometric capability or the ability to produce concentric force from a complete stop in a low position. Right? And it's not that necessarily transfers specifically, but it creates that next layer of foundation beyond the general to give them the opportunity. They're not limited in any of the positions they end up in soccer.
Yeah, and this is where we need to think about specificity with regards to the specific demands of the sport versus the tissue capacity characteristics that would support an individual's ability to do multiple movements through multiple joints in different planes of movement. And I think the way that you describe it of looking at, well, how do we try and quantify an individual's profile? And you talk about tissue capacity through the force velocity spectrum.
So through the force velocity spectrum, through the available range, and through the different contraction types. I think if you attack all three of those, they're going to have everything close to covered off. Yeah,
absolutely. And then, you think about using an example of like a squat, and you don't need to do a deep squat if you play soccer, because you're never going to be in a deep squat position. Well, the reality is you're never going to do a heavy squat in a soccer game anyway. So you're not looking at how that transfers or has relevance to the performance of soccer. And I think that's where sometimes the conversation gets misled. And like flexibility is a good example of this, where, and again, we could probably look at different types of profiles, but think of a young athlete who's good at playing soccer. Working on their flexibility and that alone probably won't have a lot of transfer, because yes, absolutely, if they do have poor flexibility, will allow them to improve their range of movement and get into positions better.
And as we've spoken about with people like David Bem, it potentially reduces their injury risk for strain type injuries and things like that.
But the other thing it does too is it then allows you to form the foundation to go, okay, now I can develop force and velocity through a larger range of movement. And that's where it is very important, because that then can influence the tissue properties that you develop based on the range of movement parameters of, say, doing a resistance training protocol. And this is where I think the conversation often gets forgotten. And like I use another example, you talk about an AFL player. It doesn't have to be an AFL player, but think about maybe more of a developed athlete who's been playing a particular sport professionally for multiple years. It's very likely that they have developed certain tissue capacity properties, particularly force and power as an example. But then if you profile that individual and you go, well, actually, your toe touch is really poor, if you use that example, you've already identified and highlighted that that is a key deficit within their tissue capacity profile. So the transfer that has to then seeing larger, say, improvements in their force output, because you all of a sudden change, say, the length tension relationship where they can produce force at longer muscle lengths, not to mention the potential improvement in their injury risk profile, because there certainly is a correlation between things like stretching with musculoskeletal injuries that changes their overall ability to perform and obviously in this situation mitigate injury. And I think that's where the conversation often gets lost about transferability is thinking about what what deficits are there in this individual athlete? What is their training history to give us an idea of what particular tissue capacities they've developed? Because undeniably, certain tissue capacity elements will have a more significant impact, at least in the short term. But then this is again come back into timeline of, well, what time period do I look at developing this individual? Because if it's over a long period of time and they are relatively low in their physical development, implementing flexibility so that they have that foundation to move through a large range of movement with their resistance training makes a lot of sense. But just doing flexibility itself is not going to be the most effective solution. So this is where we need to think a bit more nuanced about understanding what is the purpose of me applying this particular intervention and how does that particular capacity then help develop other capacities and ultimately over time their overall performance in the sport.
Yep. I think one of the things that's really important is that the reason you want to be able to have those factors developed is, and we've spoken about this a lot, is as a biological system, the human body is a complex adaptive system. And the way that it creates performance or solves physical problems in, say, a sports setting is by taking the tools that it has and being able to implement them in a dynamical way. And what we mean by that is like when a stimulus, an external stimulus is exposed to that person, they've got to navigate and find a solution to it. And if they've got more tools in their toolkit and more well-developed tools, then they're going to be able to come up with a more appropriate solution for that. So an example, and when I say tools, it's very easy to think of analogies of actually talking about, say, like carpentry. If you've got very high power output or you've got very well-developed VO2 max, right? It's like having a drill versus having a screwdriver. They both do the same job. Like you can still screw in a screw with a screwdriver, but it's a hell of a lot easier to do it with a drill, right? And having a really well-developed capability or physical characteristic means that you can actually do it with much higher proficiency. And that's what you're trying to do by developing those underlying characteristics. It's not to say that you can't get the job done. And, the coach that asked us, earlier about this is like, they're saying that you have to have this amount of power in your jump task or whatever. And it's like, you don't have to, but you've made it harder for yourself. So what do you want to do? Do you want to give the athlete the best tools to be able to do it, or do you want to give them insufficient tools and then they've got to really struggle to find the right solution? And
well, I was going to say I think another good example is performance, particularly in more wicked environments, so more complex sport domains like team sports, field sports, ball sports. Clearly, performance can be achieved in many different ways. And I know actually you and I have talked about this because I know something that you value about being a sprint coach is the performance measures are pretty clear and straightforward.
They're very objective.
Because if you think of any particular team sport, whether it's a soccer or football league, AFL, rugby league, each team, there's obviously certain similarities in terms of you have to have a certain skill set to be able to perform at a high level. But in terms of what each team and each strength and conditioning team focus on, probably would vary a bit from individual from team to team.
There'd be a lot of similarities, but there would be a lot of differences just in general approaches as well.
And that to me highlights sort of this conversation because the transfer of success from concurrent training, particularly when you get into those wicked environments, can actually be quite broad. So I think you need to be careful to make certain assumptions that this as a measure is an absolute to success or not, because you'll have plenty of people who will come along going, well, we actually don't really focus too much on heavy squatting. We just do speed squats and we find that really useful for maximizing the soccer player's performance, whatever it may be. To make certain assumptions that it's very clear that this is an absolute measure to determine success is very misleading.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's overall, with this discussion, I think that that's the key thing that you need to understand, that if you don't have the underlying physical characteristics, you're going to make it harder for yourself. But don't think just because you have them that the correlation, as you mentioned, is going to be causal, because it won't be. What you need to understand is that you need to give them the tools, and if they've got those tools, then they're in a position to be able to try and solve the problem that's in front of them. And you just mentioned this, like the more complex the environment becomes, the more open it is, the more variables going on, the less likely that transfer is to be, a stronger correlation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on there, Jack, about like what transfers? We didn't talk a hell of a lot about those sort of very high transfer tasks. The ones that ergonomically are similar, that second tier in that hierarchy that Bondarchuk talks about. I think those tasks are the ones that, other than the competitive exercise, they're going to transfer a lot, and they're probably the thing that once you have the physical characteristics that you will allow you to transfer to the physical, whether it's say power or whatever, to the task. Because what you're doing is as I said, you're finding a stressor that's either an overstress or an understress, or some sort of way of putting the problem to that athlete in a very specific task to what they do in their sport. So
what I was going to say, maybe even more simply, is if you observe someone performing, you get indications of what things that they need to work on. Then when you get in, you could then use sport-specific training where you create certain constraints to make them have to emphasize greater acceleration, greater deceleration, greater change of direction. So that is the opportunity for you to go, how do I create certain parameters so they have to work on these particular physical demands? And then you can even then work the next level down, because then when you go to the general specific, that's when you start to think about, well, how is it that of stuff I do in the gym helps support their ability to perform certain physical demands in this constrained environment that then feeds into their ability to perform at a competitive level.
I do feel that there's a lot of people that jump straight to those tasks without having developed some of those underlying physical characteristics.
Yeah.
And it means that they don't transfer very well to the actual competitive task. Right. But, and it's very funny, like I had to go through this process a little bit myself and realize, like, actually a lot of my athletes have a lot of the physical characteristics, and I had to make the things that we do on the track, for instance, that are support exercises, closer, or at least ask them to stress those physical characteristics to develop, say like power, explosive power or horizontal, production or whatever it is, to make sure that they were actually transferring to the task. Like as an example, for instance, we do, for elastic development, we do drop jumps. Now you can obviously take that wherever you want, and we've spoken about the Russians jumping off 3 meters, all this kind of stuff. But one of the things that we implemented that I feel had a really strong effect on the skill side of the development, as well as the actual physical characteristic of elastic function on ground contact, was the use of, say, weighted vest of small amounts. And people who are in this area and have interest in this area have seen that they have that, like, I think it's called LALO or LILO system, where it's like weighted segments. You can have it on different parts of your limb, so it actually increases the amount of inertia that happens, say, in your shin or on your arm when you're actually running, and it will allow you to understand not only the sensory information, but give you the opportunity to apply more forces to get that transfer when you take them off to the task of, say, running. And
I was going to say that actually fits in well with the analogy I used before of, say, stretching, and that stretching may not necessarily have a direct correlation to an improvement in performance at sport, but it then provides a foundation for you to be able to do differences or improve your range of movement through resistance training. But then, like you're mentioning here, what's that next step you need to take to get the transfer more closer to the sport by creating certain constraints in the environment or the task that you're doing to then see the complete transfer into the actual competition?
So overall, like, because we should wrap this up, but overall, I think the key thing is if you want to know if something transfers, you do have to do a little bit of an analysis, whether that's through research or collecting some empirical data yourself to know, okay, what's the minimum standard that I need to reach? What area or what stage of development is the person that I'm working with at? And then you want to try and fill in those physical characteristics so that you can then take them to tasks that are, as you said, constraining and creating opportunities for problem solving. And throughout all of that, the thing's probably going to be constant is their ability to participate in the sport and keeping some general foundational features in place.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Jack.
All right. Do you want to send me